In August 1965, 30,000 to 35,000 Black Angelinos in the greater South Central area engaged in a week of insurrection, angered by brutal police and deplorable segregation. 32 Black civilians were killed largely by police. The center of the rebellion was in Watts, but the uprising actually took place throughout the 46 square mile area of greater South Central, where Blacks were forced to live. About 75% of LA's Black population lived there at the time. During the week of this uprising, 250,000 Angelinos were put under curfew. And they were patrolled by 14,000, around the third day when the curfew started and the National Guard came in. 14,000 National Guardsmen came in, pretty much all white. Almost 4,000 Black people were arrested, mainly for minor offenses like curfew violations. $45 million worth of property was ultimately destroyed. It was largely white-owned businesses that were ransacked and burned down in Watts, while Black businesses were largely spared. So Black civil rights activist Bayard Rustin said in 1966, reflecting on this, the whole point of the outbreak in Watts was that it marked the first major rebellion of Negroes against their own masochism and was carried on with the express purpose of asserting that they would no longer quietly submit to the deprivation of slum life. So I'm just going to briefly get into the why before we get into the why of the uprising, before I get into the short timeline of it. So to understand the uprising, you have to understand the years of segregation that Black Angelinos faced in the decades before. Los Angeles was little different from the South in its treatment of Blacks. 1% of new housing in LA in the 1950s went to non-whites. Glendale, Burbank, Culver City were all white sundown towns. Torrance was all white, and civil rights activists picketed for over a year and a half in 1963 to demand that Black people be allowed to buy homes there. It wasn't super successful, but, they tried. 90% of housing had illegal covenant contracts, which said Black people couldn't live there. They were illegal, but, they kept going. And a thing that I didn't know was that in 1965, Alameda Boulevard, it's like right next to the Blue Line, if you know where the Blue Line is, or the A Line, it's called now, the light rail. So Alameda Boulevard was a dividing line with the white suburbs to the east of Southgate, Huntington Park. White supremacist gangs used to beat Black people up if they saw them east of Alameda after dark. So this was the context. Public swimming pools in LA were segregated through the 1950s. Beaches were also de facto segregated through the 60s. There were extremely high levels of unemployment for Black people in LA, despite a booming economy. It's not like the economy was doing bad. It was increasingly better. So 20% unemployment was in South Central, and there was 30% male unemployment in Watts. Blacks were in overcrowded schools at the same time that there were under-enrolled schools in West LA. There were various attempts by the civil rights movement to have Black students try to go to these under-enrolled white schools, but they were all thwarted. So I'll get a little bit into the timeline of the uprising. So the catalyst for the beginning of the rebellion was a large crowd witnessing white police brutalize young Black men being arrested. After the driver resisted arrest, a cop called for backup, and 26 different police cars and motorcycles showed up just to arrest the people. The crowd initially had just been observing, but began to resist and fight the police after they saw them manhandle the young man's mother and saw a CHP officer put a woman into a chokehold. One witness at the scene complained about police beating a man, and a cop told him, "Get out of here, N-word, get out of here, all you N-words." And that night, 1,000 people scuffled with the cops there. Importantly, many of these cops were white Southerners. The police chief had actively recruited white Southerners to the LAPD. Also, 5 weeks before this happened, a Black 22-year-old woman, Beverly Tate, was arrested by corrupt police and taken away in a car to an empty area while she was raped in the police car while the other cop was a lookout outside. The cop was fired, but he was never tried. This was something the community had been well aware of when this happened, the uprising, and they were very angry about it. So on the second day of the rebellion, the morning had started out normally, despite the night before, but by 6 p.m., thousands of people were back on the streets of Watts and damaged 103 cop cars that came. Looting only really started on the third day of the uprising around lunch. That Friday night, a resident witnessed cops beat up a young child and beat them up and hit them in the face with a shotgun for having carried a stolen lamp. That night, the National Guard came in with the first unit coming in from all-white Glendale, arguably the most racist town in LA. They and the police killed 10 people on Friday night, the third night of the uprising. On the fourth day, a curfew was declared, and unsubstantiated rumors that blacks were going to attack white neighborhoods have been spread on the news. National Guard techs guarded USC, and the National Guard had loaded machine guns on their vehicles. The police made absolutely no pretense that they weren't racist. The LAPD chief compared rioters to the Viet Cong. The Vietnam War draft had just started the year before. In fact, a guardsman said he had been told the Viet Cong were behind the Watts rebels by the intelligence of the police or whatever. Despite many rumors, the only cops and military who were killed during this uprising were 2 cops who were killed by other cops, which is utterly unsurprising to me, given that when I went to the June protests against ICE and the National Guard and all that, the LA sheriffs tear-gassed LAPD right in front of them, while trying to tear-gas me. But so anyway, while there were some white civilians who were beaten, unfortunately, they were largely they were basically whites that lived east of Alameda and they were going through Watts, and that's why they were beaten up. But local community members and activists rescued these civilians. And just also Mexicans that were right next door were largely left alone. Cops and military shot into people's homes during this whole police occupation. One SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, if you know what that is, organizer said that while sitting on his porch listening to the radio, a cop told him, "Get your black ass back in your house." And a National Guard Jeep drove by with the cop, I think, he came back, and shot 3 rounds at his door while he was entering the house, but luckily he was uninjured. Unfortunately, another man next day was not so lucky and was shot by 15 cops from outside his house, who shot into his house and killed him inside of his house. He was unarmed and everything. So by the 5th day, Watts was under near total military and police occupation. On the 6th day, the police turned back, but did not arrest multiple white vigilantes who were trying to go into Watts armed with guns and Molotov cocktails. By this day, on the 5th day, 4,000 arrestees were in jail with unaffordable bail set at $5,000. On the 7th day of the riots, the curfew, the police had largely taken control, and the curfew was lifted. Martin Luther King came on that day and spoke to people in Watts to hear their concerns. He also spoke for 3 hours with the mayor of LA, Yorty, and LAPD Chief Parker. And the LAPD chief berated him in the press and said that the MLK's visit was a disservice to the people of Los Angeles. And if this wasn't bad enough, after everything was under control and the police had control of the situation, the next day, on Wednesday, August 18th, 100 LAPD and sheriffs at 2 a.m. shot up the Nation of Islam mosque on Broadway and arrested 19 men inside, various of whom were injured. But I mean, completely, all the windows were shattered. There were just tons of bullets. Then after they left, the cops set the mosque on fire. And then they arrested 40 black Muslims who had come to witness, they heard the mosque was being attacked, and they arrested them. So the police chief had blamed Muslims, familiar story, for instigating the uprising. But other powers in B also tried to blame communist agitators and civil rights activists of causing the whole uprising. So I want to get back a little bit to the history preceding this. So obviously, as you can tell, there was a ton of racism in LA. The mayor of LA, Yorty, was obviously super racist. The chief was not only super racist, he was pretty openly racist, but shockingly, even the Archbishop of the Catholic Church in LA was super racist, to the point that a priest sent a telegram to the Pope telling him that that guy was super racist. So other things that happened that were shocking, like leading up to all this, going back a little bit, in the 1940s, in 1941 and 1947, hundreds of white students at Fremont High School in South LA, 2 different years, like many years apart, burned effigies of black students angry when a handful of black students were enrolled at their all-white schools. So this was not a situation of a few bad apples or like a large minority. This was really widespread support for white supremacy and segregation in LA. There had been attempts to like integrate the schools a little bit in LA, but that did not go anywhere. And the school board claimed that they didn't keep track of student bases because they were colorblind, but they just didn't want people to know how extremely racially segregated LA schools were. The French currently take a very similar approach to not taking stats, I think for similar reasons. While all this was going on, leading up to the rebellion, Black Angelenos were hardly taking this lightly and were very engaged in the struggle for civil rights. There was a great deal of grassroots protests and direct action. Far too much to summarize in this talk, but I'll just give a couple things that happened. When the DNC came to LA in 1960, 5,000 Black Angelenos marched to the sports arena where the DNC was demanding civil rights now, not later. In 1961, 20,000 people showed up to hear Martin Luther King speak. Civil rights activists worked really hard to get the California Fair Housing Act passed in 1963, which again outlawed racial discrimination in housing. In 1963, a solidarity rally with civil rights protesters in Birmingham, Alabama, where children had been beat up by the local cops. At that solidarity rally, 40,000 people came to hear MLK speak. And this is really important what MLK said at the time. He said in his speech, "You asked me what Los Angeles can do to help us in Birmingham. The most important thing you can do is to set Los Angeles free because you have segregation and discrimination here and police brutality." So that's what he was. It was a really bad situation here. It was like, you got to work on your house because it's just as bad as the South is basically what he was saying. Unfortunately, the white majority in California in the 1960s was committed to white supremacy. In 1964, there was the ballot Proposition 14, which rescinded that law, the Fair Housing Law, against discrimination in housing. It passed. The white voters voted for it about 3/4 for this. The law was actually supported by the Real Estate Industry Association, and this pro-segregation law was endorsed by the LA Times. Martin Luther King had come to California multiple times to campaign against it, and this was passed 4 months after LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, the president, signed the Civil Rights Act. So LBJ cut off all housing funds to California as a response, and 2 years later, the law was struck down by courts. Even many liberal LA white politicians were still quite racist. So Liberal County Health Supervisor Kenneth Hahn argued that Black men receiving government assistance should be required to do farm work. Familiar thing we're hearing now from another white supremacist. The obvious fact that descendants of enslaved people who were forced to do farm work would not willingly go to labor in fields involuntarily for other people, white people, eluded him. And he really was a liberal white politician. He just did not see that. So white flight after rebellion happened. The areas adjacent to where I mentioned where it used to be the line, Alameda, those areas white people just left. And it opened up to blacks and other non-whites, and now the cities are largely Latino, like I mentioned, like Southgate. Well, white flight certainly wasn't the hope of the result to fight segregation. An important thing that happened was the Watts Uprising ended the illusion in America that segregation was merely a problem in the South. This was with a line before this happened that it was just a Southern problem, and this was quite a lie. Unfortunately, the more things change, the more they stay the same. We are in the midst of a fascist white supremacist backlash with an openly racist president. While we have certainly made a lot of progress in integration, a lot of things are not that different. My elementary school was all Latino and Black. And even my middle school was mostly that, with a handful of Asian students. No white students. I didn't go to school, have any classmates that were white until I was 14. A major change now, however, is that when the white supremacist President Trump sent the National Guard to menace people of color and liberals in LA, the National Guard was much more racially representative of LA and far less eager to beat the crap out of us. While obviously the police, regardless of their color, are still really eager to do that, as I personally witnessed this summer. We have made a lot of progress in higher education and in employment compared to the past, but residential and education segregation remains stubbornly high and has only been gradually chipped away at over the last couple decades. So we have far too much segregation in Los Angeles to this day, but remember that all the integration and opportunities that Black people and other people of color here have in LA was earned through intense collective struggle. Most Black, Latino people that live outside of South, Central, and East LA are able to be there because the Black masses fought intensely for freedom of movement. We are continuing those same struggles of those who came before us and fighting to defend the freedoms that were hard won.